Hello, my little wine introverts. Welcome back to Introvert Wine Podcast by Xenia. This is still me, and this is already episode 6. Yay! Which is titled The Science of Wine. And I think a lot of us are somewhat intimidated or scared by all the chemistry, all the science behind the wine. So I wanted to have an episode dedicated to some of the aspects and the chemistry and the scientific aspect of wine that would maybe break down some of the concepts, the myths, break some of the stereotypes, and make it more digestible, exciting, and maybe spark some interest in you to study and follow and research some of the topics even further. And I'm really, really excited to host this episode with Nicholas Spencer, who is a PhD, a WSET diploma holder, and divine academic among many things, and who has been studying the science of tribology for decades now. And if you think that tribology has something to do with tribes, you are wrong. And in this episode, we're going to speak about mouthfeel of the wine, about this exciting relationship of saliva and tannins, and also about some other aspects of the wine as well as acidity, our tasting experiences, some tips, etc. And I'm always very, very fascinated how people from different careers and other professions end up in the wine industry. So Nick's going to speak about his journey into wine, which includes being stuck at a winery during the pandemics. And I hope you will learn something from this episode and as much as I did, because I don't have it in me to break this episode into different parts. I feel like it's going to be just one, just our discussion without any interruptions, because we had such amazing flow with Nick that I did not want to split it into parts, and I hope you will enjoy it as much as I did. Hello, Nicholas. Very welcome to my little podcast episode. Could you please present yourself and speak briefly about your background?
Hi, Xenia. Nice to be here. Nice to see you. Yes, I was born in London. I grew up in South London. Fairly uneventful childhood. Although from the age of about 7, I knew I wanted to be a chemist. So maybe a little bit unusual. And then I went to school, did all the usual things people do if they want to go to university, and then I ended up going to Cambridge. And I was in Cambridge for 6 years up until PhD. And I got more and more interested in surface chemistry, and that kind of became my career. And then if you're interested in an academic career, you tend to do a postdoctoral fellowship. And at that time, the place to go was the US. So I went to UC Berkeley and I was there for a couple of years. And that was an amazing experience, partly because of the science, but and I was working on ammonia synthesis there, so something a little bit different, but still related to surfaces. But it was also just amazing being in California, and that was my first experience spending some time in wineries. Napa was not like it is today. It wasn't the kind of Disneyland it is today, and it was a great place just to drive up to and spend a day, which you could easily do from Berkeley. Drove up in my VW Beetle and spent the day up there.
Oh, that sounds like a dream.
It was great. And but I had to get a job after that. And I decided in the meantime, I think it was because of the economic situation, that maybe I should go into industry. There was some interesting, pretty open-ended research projects going on in industry at that time. So I went into the chemical industry on the East Coast. And I was there for about 11 years, and I had quite a good time. I was living in Washington, D.C., got married, started a family while I was there. Got a bit fed up with Washington, which was very dangerous at the time. So kind of worried about the kids. And also I was fed up having a boss. And this was a big attraction to go back into academia. And so I started looking around. Didn't have much luck in the US, but this job came up in Zurich, which was actually a far better university than any of the ones I was looking at in America. And yeah, they seemed to like me, and we moved to Zurich about just over 30 years ago. And so I was a professor at the ETH in Zurich for 30 years, teaching surface science. and getting into this field of tribology, which I'll talk a bit more about later, which is everything to do with friction, wear, and lubrication. And I never thought at the time I was teaching it that this would have a relevance to wine, but it did in the end, and that's how I'm spending some of my time now. So now I'm after retirement. I got into wine, and that was kind of so this was all to do with I can thank COVID actually for this because
No,
the year I
it
retired
is
was
curious, exactly. Like that was my
oh
curiosity
really?
because also for me, because I also switched career, like I kind of work and have kind of wine related jobs and projects, not for long. I think it's been like 5 or 6 years, and I had a career in HR what was completely nothing to do with wine. So it's always a curiosity for me what triggers people, what brings them into wine, and why they decide, specifically after quite a successful career in a different area, completely in a different industry, like what brings you, what gets you into
Right,
wine that you go into such depth. Like
right.
me and you, we did the WSET diploma, which I understand what I do for me for the career in future, but for you, what brought you into wine and why did you decide to study it really like at a very high level?
Well, I guess I was always interested. I always enjoyed drinking wine, and I always enjoyed visiting wineries and family trips to Tuscany. As I had a lot of exposure to wines in the Chianti area. And also, I'd been going to Argentina quite a bit because I dance tango. And so you basically have to go to Argentina occasionally if you dance tango. But in order to see some other parts of the country, I thought it'd be nice to see wine regions. So we visited Mendoza and Salta and Jujuy, and this was all great fun. And in 2020, we decided to do a tango trip um, to Buenos Aires. And before that, we thought we'll do a week in the Club Tapiz, which belongs to the Tapiz winery in Mendoza. Um, and so we went and stayed there and had a great time for 24 hours, visiting some friends up in the Valle de Uco. And we went to the El Enemigo winery for
Oh,
dinner,
I
which
love
was
it. Yeah.
incredible because you have
Hmm.
about 15 wines and 12 courses. So that was a great 24 hours. And when we got back to the hotel, we were told we had to go into quarantine. This was a new regulation that had just been issued by the government. And so we were suddenly in quarantine for 2 weeks. So that was meant to be the entire length of our Argentina trip. So that was that. We were stuck in our room for 2 weeks. And then the whole country went into lockdown. All of the airports closed. So we were sort of stuck in this winery for 2 months.
Wow. Well,
They
first
very
of all,
kindly,
not the worst place to be stuck,
well, this is true. This is true. I mean, nobody feels sorry for me
but
when I say
also
that.
two
And it
months.
was great in every respect. Obviously, infinite amounts of wine and access to food was fine. They gave us a house to live in well,
Oh,
they rented
wow.
us a house to live in on
Hmm.
property because they had to close the hotel.
Oh, wow.
So we could cook for ourselves and we could go out and buy food from roadside stalls. And the kitchen of the hotel was open so they could feed the grape pickers because the harvest was coming up. So they could order us food, but they weren't allowed to prepare food for us.
Mm.
Anyway, that was all great. And we had this beautiful view of the Andes and the weather was good, at least at the beginning. We arrived in late summer. But the problem was we had absolutely no idea how we were ever going to get home. And I mean, there were no flights at all anymore. There were occasional rescue flights, and we missed those because we found out about the
Late,
Swiss
yeah.
ones and the German ones too late.
Mm.
We were in Mendoza, not in Buenos Aires anyway.
No, no.
And finally, I remembered that I also had a British passport, and I called the British embassy, and they said, "Oh, we have two flights, and you can get on one of them." So we rushed our way across the country by road. We got picked up and driven over there, partly with police escort.
Oh, wow.
And then, yeah, then we came back. But I think the whole experience of being in the winery,
Mm.
watching the harvest happen, watching them make the sparkling wine, which is what they did in that particular area. Helping them do the riddling even of
Oh,
of the
nice.
bottles. They do it by hand there.
Mm-hmm.
I suddenly got much more interested in the whole process. And then
Mm-hmm.
as soon as I got back, I enrolled in WSET level 2
Mm-hmm.
in the Académie du Vin in Switzerland. And then immediately went on to level 3 and then enrolled in Rust level 4. So it was all very fast. So from 20 started the courses in 2021, and in 2023 I got my diploma and Wine Academica. So I think it was a very rapid education I went through,
Oh yeah.
which I think shows up in my tasting. I don't think I'm a particularly talented taster, and in fact everybody said you won't have any problem in the diploma tasting exam.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody passes that, and I didn't. And I think everybody passes that because almost everybody comes from the wine industry, so they've
Yeah,
been
that's
tasting for
true.
year, but I hadn't really. And so
Mm.
after I failed it the first time, I've been focusing on the theory too, which
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, I got some coaching from Anne McHale,
Mm-hmm.
especially on how to write tasting notes, and
Mm.
that was so useful. And then I retook the exam, and I got a nice result after
Mm.
that.
Well, I also know a lot of people who actually work in the wine industry and don't pass the tasting part. So it's really, there is some luck to it on whatever flight you get, whether
Yeah,
you're kind of more familiar with this variety or not. And there is the system exactly like of writing the tasting notes, because even if you understand the wine, you know the wine, how you write, how you put it down, how you explain it, I think is even more important than you guessing the wine.
right.
But coming back to your background in chemistry and all the did it help you at first, or does it make it more difficult because you are evaluating the wine in a different perspective?
Well, I probably am evaluating it differently, but I do think it helps because I'm not scared by any of it. I mean, I'm not scared by any of the technology or the biochemistry or the chemistry. So I think it helps in that respect. You know, I understand the chemical nature of the
Or the process, yeah.
components and how they might interact. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think, and the other thing I found, especially when I was writing the couple of dissertations we had to do, it's very useful to be used to the structure of a scientific paper, especially from the point of view of being able to extract the useful information from a paper. And on top of that, since I'm still an emeritus professor, I have access to the whole scientific literature. So it's never a problem getting hold of any kind of scientific literature. And even things that are not specifically chemistry, like the biochemistry or microbiology, I know enough about that at least I can figure out the main points. And if I don't understand something, I know enough people in the fields that I can ask. So I know who to ask. So all of that's very useful. And I think that the science part of wine is what attracts me to it so much. The fact that it's got, 20 different areas of science that are vital to wine, whether it's climate science or geology or biochemistry or microbiology, et cetera. And that's what makes it fascinating to me. I mean,
Yeah.
even the economics of it, I find very interesting.
No, I totally agree that it's such a multifaceted kind of area that not a lot of people understand. And when they get into it, they're totally mesmerized. I've seen people being like tasting really simple, affordable wines, and then one thing will switch them totally on, and they will like, oh, there's so much more to it, which is really inspiring, like from the side of a sommelier to see this transition of it being just a beverage to all this area of, like, as you said, there is economics, there's chemistry, there's geology, there's so many aspects that for sure there is something in it that will catch your attention, and then it kind of sum ups to the other ones. But
Right. I think in terms of tasting, something that occurred to me, so weekend before last, I was in Jura, and tasting vin jaune and the various wines that have been put under floor.
Mhm.
And it was interesting because as soon as I tasted that, I could smell acetaldehyde. So it was, and which is the same thing you get when you taste Fino sherry, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And that kind of took me back because when I was a 10-year-old chemist at home, I actually synthesized organic molecules in my parents' kitchen, and acetaldehyde was one of them. So I actually smelled acetaldehyde for the first time at a very young
It
age.
is really curious how you describe how you taste and what you get, because you think in molecules and the chemical components, whereas when I smell acetaldehyde, probably it brings me to kind of curry, like some bruised, like it's not the same sensation. So when I'm tasting the
Right.
wine, I think in fruit, like in fruit or in spice, or like I really visualize, or maybe even sometimes color, like when you smell, like for example, Vin jaune, it will be like brownish to me. I'll have this
Mm,
idea that like this is what I see, whereas you gonna pick up the very specific elements. And this was one of the things that I really was fascinated when we were tasting together in Rust, how different people describe the wines and how they taste.
mm,
It was really curious because I had at the same table with me Ljubica from Serbia, who is a winemaker, and how she also, like her first seconds of the wine tasting, it was fascinating to me because she's so used to detect the faults in the wine, like the volatile acidity of the bread, that she
mm,
would not, like her face would give it away immediately. Whereas I'm, as a sommelier, I would be more forgiving for the wine to have like a little bit of that, because for me it's a complexity, it's forest floor or this, and in her face it would be like, no, this is the fault. Like,
mm.
this is not okay, totally. So what, when you are tasting the wine, so maybe walk us through like your experience. What do you pay attention to, and what do you think you do differently versus like a winemaker, sommelier? So when you are tasting the wine, what are the things that gonna help you guide yourself through the process a bit?
I'm not sure I'm particularly gifted at it. I don't do it in any particularly unusual or special way. I think I run through. I mean, I run through the categories in my mind. Does it taste of this? Does it taste of this? And then run through the possibilities. I think just one thing I noticed now teaching beginner wine lessons is that you have to really tell people to focus on specific things and does it taste of that or not, rather than saying what does it taste of, because the answer is usually wine. And so it's and I do that. I run through the things in my mind, the various categories of primary, secondary, tertiary, and so on. So really classical, really not particularly unusual stuff, unless there's something that I recognize as a simple chemical, because most of the aromas and flavors are really complex and they're really complex mixtures. And you may think it smells like strawberry, but it isn't exactly strawberry.
No.
It has some chemical
Yeah.
similarity to things that are also present in strawberries, but there are probably half a dozen molecules that make strawberries smell of strawberries.
Hmm.
And so it's only really what it's doing in your brain, what memories it's evoking and so on. But when it's simple molecules like acetaldehyde or TCA, for example, TCA, for some reason, I'm incredibly sensitive to TCA. So I've been known to send back 2 bottles in a row in a restaurant. So for some reason, I'm very sensitive to cork taint. And then also the petrol smell in Riesling, I'm incredibly sensitive to. I'm not at all sensitive to Brett. I mean, I never noticed Brett when everyone else is saying, "Oh God, there's too much Brett
I
in it."
think I
I
think you
just
need
can't really detect it.
Yeah, I think you need to kind of train yourself, because I don't find unpleasant, and I think there is a certain threshold that my brain is okay with it, so it doesn't register it. So if you're sensitive to it, like you are for TCA, you would have this, whereas my brain, until a certain amount, it doesn't, it's like it's there among so many other things that my brain is not kind of alerting me. Whereas when it's too much of it, I will be like, oh yes, that's it. But it's still, at some point, it's not bothering me. And I do think that sommeliers tend to be more forgiving towards it, because there's so many trendy regions that kind of have this bread like their trademark, like Burgundy or Beaujolais
Yeah,
or Loire.
yeah,
There are so many fancy brand names, really, that for
right.
them it's part of their, so the sommeliers are like, yeah, okay, it's like part of the
Yeah,
of the wine
yeah,
now. Whereas, as I said, like the winemakers, they would be so and I think they're also trained, even though they might not be naturally super susceptible to it and registered. I think they're trained themselves as well to kind of detect it even at a minimum amount, because that can signal to them far more problems in the winery versus just
mm,
one of the aromas in the wine.
yeah,
So I was curious, actually. I'm not sure if you are the correct person to ask it, because I was taught that your brain does not recognize the smell unless it met it somewhere. So your brain does not have this kind of library of smells already integrated in your brain. It only registers it, and like if you smelled it once, and then it kind of has this connection of your, let's say, name or definition for the smell, and then it has this practical experience. Only then you're able to detect and kind of find it out whenever you kind of meet this smell, this aroma again in
yeah.
your life.
No,
Yeah.
I think that's my experience too.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's not even then. I mean, I think we all know the experience of smelling something and saying, "Oh God, what is that?"
Exactly. Yeah.
And so there's also the connection between the smell and the memory also needs to be kept limber, if you like, needs to be exercised.
Hmm.
These sets of smells come in very useful that you can
Oh yeah, they're very
train
fascinating.
yourself with.
I don't
Yeah.
think we had those back then in Kazakhstan when I was competing in sommelier competition, and I did not, like, my brain did not know how certain things smelled, like all the spices, like, because not all the countries have the same kind of
Yeah, of
set of
course. Yeah.
fruits or spice or
Yeah, or
like.
flowers. I mean, there's some
Exactly.
flowers,
So
you
I
know.
went to a market, to a Sunday market where they have this all the spices selection, and I just smelled things, and the ladies were looking so weirdly at me, and I was like, I'm sorry, like, I have to do it. Like, I have no idea of like majoram or oregano, like I have to smell it,
Yeah,
like, for my
yeah,
brain to register it. But coming back to chemistry and your experience and your knowledge, one of the things that I enjoyed listening to your notes is your description of the tannin, of the structure of the tannin in mouthfeel overall.
yeah. I mean, that's something where I'm spending a lot of time now, actually doing some research in labs. Um, and what I wrote my thesis on for the Weinakademiker got me really interested in the whole area of what leads to mouthfeel, what causes particular sensations in mouthfeel. Because if you think back to the way we're meant to describe tannins in the diploma, there's a very large number of descriptors that we can use, and basically the effect of tannins is astringency. And astringency itself has all of these sub qualities, drying and roughness and puckering, and all of these are different. And yet, why is tannin causing all of these? So I dug into the literature, and it's actually fascinating what tannin is doing to the layer of saliva on the tongue. So all of this is basically changes in the friction of the tongue against the palate, and the saliva is lubricating that interaction. So this is totally in my comfort zone, right? This is what I've been doing for the last 15 years or something, looking at how molecules lubricate and what affects that. And also the structure of the saliva on the tongue is fascinating, because the saliva has these chains in it called mucins, and there are many different kinds of mucins, and they assemble themselves in a certain way on the tongue, and they're responsible for the lubrication. And then when the tannin comes in, it binds up these things in different ways. And tannin is not always tannin. That can also come in many different sizes and shapes. And it's constantly rearranging as the wine ages. So there's so many possible interactions there. I find the whole thing fascinating. And I'm now working with a saliva expert in London, And we're trying to create a surface that mimics the tongue, that has the same kind of saliva structure, because they don't just stick, they stick in a particular order onto the tongue surface. There's a mucin that comes out of the cells on the top of the tongue, and then the rest of the mucins self-assemble onto that. And then the tannins come in and they interact with that in different ways. And then the acidity in the wine also gets involved in that interaction. And then things like the polysaccharides, the maltodextrins and various other things that come from the yeast or from the grapes, they also interact, and they can even help the lubrication. So some of the polysaccharides form a lubricating layer on the tongue, and the alcohol interferes with the interaction between the tannins and the
There's so
mucins.
many components. It's
But
driving
that's
me
an
crazy.
important factor, because that's one of the reasons why low alcohol wines or non-alcohol wines are such a disaster. It's because the mouthfeel is absent. So they have to put in sugar or whatever,
Yeah.
or make it sparkling to just give you some mouthfeel.
Mhm.
And so I'm now collaborating with people in Geisenheim as well on non-alcoholic wines, and we're doing some measurements in London on the friction and trying to use the model tongue surface that we're constructing with the saliva guys in order to evaluate non-alcohol wines and try and understand why they
And
they
try to
don't have
help
the
them. Yeah.
mouthfeel.
Okay, that's very interesting. I have an issue. I'm curious as well if you can explain to me. I am so very often confusing high acidity and high alcohol when I taste the wine, because it brings me sometimes the same sensation. Like it has this kind of burning, also salivating, and I would think, especially if it's one of the first wines you taste in the morning or whatever your tasting session is, and everything feels acidic, obviously, as usually it does the first ones you try. That's why they advise you to calibrate before you take an exam. But also I have noticed so many times that I confuse it with high alcohol, and the wines, for example, the wines from south of France that would naturally have not so much acidity, they would feel very refreshing, and I would salivate a lot because of the alcohol and not the acidity, which has been killing me for so long. It's very confusing. Do you have I don't know,
Well,
a solution to that?
this could be just one of the frustrating things about doing research with saliva, and I've now done quite a lot of measurements with saliva where I'm measuring friction using my own saliva. If I use someone else's saliva, I get a different result. Or if you have saliva after having different meals, I mean, you always clean out your mouth and so on, but saliva is pretty variable. And I think one of the reasons people have different sensations is because their salivas are all different.
Oh, yeah.
And so, when we finally write a paper on the stuff we're doing now, it's going to say that the saliva was collected from a 69-year-old healthy volunteer. So we're only going to use one person's saliva for the
Okay.
measurements.
So you're gonna measure it towards one person to make sure that the results are kind of valid for.
Yeah, well, it'll probably say male as well, because I think that's another difference.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's so it could be that you've just got a particular salivary layer that reacts in that particular way to alcohol. Because I have to say, I don't have that confusion. I don't think I'm particularly gifted, as I say, at wine tasting, but I can always pick out acidity. And I think I associate alcohol with body and acidity, not really. So I don't really have that confusion.
No, I've noticed
Lots of
it.
other confusions, but
No,
not.
I mean, yeah, there are always tons of confusion, but I have marked that about myself specifically because I'm doing the French blind tasting competition, which has kind of tastings every other month. And they do tend to have a lot of wines from south of France, the whites specifically. And I have noticed that this has been confusing to me a lot, even like specifically maybe for that style of wine, because they would have the mouthfeel, the alcohol, and that will bring them the freshness. And I start salivating as if they have the acidity. And in our tasting group, I think, the only one with this issue. So I do think that maybe it's indeed very personal. But because if it's a different style of wine, I can clearly differentiate the acidity from the alcohol. I think it's just this particular style because it does have the mouthfeel due to the varieties, the winemaking, and the alcohol. So I'm trying to maybe now train myself specifically for that, because I also did not realize I had this issue for so long. So maybe most of the time, the wines that I was tasting did in fact have high acidity, and it was
Right.
in combination with the alcohol, so it kind of was safe. But now with this specific style and wine regions, maybe this was like bringing it to light, like, you know, like there is this issue. I'm
Yeah.
curious. I'm still in exploration in
I mean,
if it's
another thing that interests me, as well as tannins, is the whole area of acidity, because acidity is not acidity. There are quite a few organic acids that can end up in wine, either from the grape or from things like malolactic fermentation. You can change the spectrum of acids that are in there, and they all become acidic at different pH values, which means that when they're exposed to an environment that's a different pH, then they're going to have more or less detectable acidity. So it's like the difference between total acidity and pH. That's why they're two different concepts. And I think that this acidity composition, which acids are actually present, can have an enormous effect on the mouthfeel, but also on things like the length. Because once you've taken your sip of wine, then you resalivate, and as you resalivate, the pH in your mouth is changing from the wine pH to the normal mouth pH, and during that time, any residual acids in there are going to be they're going to be going through their transition from not being acidic to being acidic. So I think that's a very interesting area of research that hasn't been looked at a lot. And given that acidity interacts with the tannin interaction with the saliva, I think it could have a very big effect on mouthfeel.
Yeah, I've heard some people when tasting they can just what they say they can distinguish if it's malic or lactic acid, but I think it's not just the acidity, it's overall, as you said, the mouthfeel, the length, like a bunch of factors as well that influence. Because of course, if you separate them, they are different and they have a different like taste and sensation, obviously. But just to be able to already in a ready wine to say which acidity is dominating or which, for example, is absent or not, I think that's maybe too far-fetched, but it's definitely an interesting area. And we also had a nice discussion at an MW introductory course about acidification, because it's allowed in a lot of regions, and with the climate change, maybe it will get like a normal practice to a lot of winemakers and regions, is whether you can taste the added acidity, the acidity
which is always tartaric, right?
Yeah. I mean,
so
in most
it's
cases,
not going to be the same. It's not going to be a nice spectrum of different acids. It's going to be 100% tartaric.
Yeah, but also what some of the winemakers said, that you would add this while the wine is still in the fermentation phase, and then while it's fermenting, it's impossible to tell in the ready wine that you actually acidified, because if you add it already at the fermentation, it's going to better integrate it. And that in most cases is when they're adding the additional acidity if they need it. So we had, and there are also other, like the other side of the argument, who's saying like you can tell if it's artificial acidified. For some wines, I would say it's obvious, but I think it more also connected with the overall quality level, like the wine, that you can tell that maybe it's so disproportional and unbalanced that you can tell that, yeah, probably it's going to be, it was acidified. Versus when you add maybe not a big amount and then you add it during the fermentation phase, it's better integrated, and it's really close to not being able to actually
right. But when people
identify.
say things like it's better integrated, there's an awful lot of chemistry behind that statement, right? And so if it really is better integrated, that probably means that it's reacted with something, or the yeast has somehow metabolized it into something else. And it'd be really interesting to know what has happened to that
Hmm.
tartaric acid, if anything. I mean, it could be that it's just being masked by something else. Like there's this classic experiment that they recommend you do in WSET1 is to make the students taste a solution of tartaric acid that is really horribly acidic, and then quite a strong sugar solution, which is horribly sweet. And then you mix the two, and it
And
actually
it's
tastes
okay.
quite pleasant. And that's such an instructive experiment because, I mean, this is why Cabinet works so well, right? It's a beautifully illustrative experiment, but I think it's probably something similar going on, not with sugar, but something else that may be masking or reacting with the tartaric acid that may be created during the fermentation process.
No, it's all very fascinating.
And there's a
And
lot that is still unknown, right?
yeah, no, it's
It's
a
people are just
continuous.
scratching the surface.
Yeah, no, like I have friends who are asking me like, when are you done with your like wine studies? Like it's never ending. It's just something pops up and it's all evolving and changing. There's no end. Once you're in the wine industry, I think it's a ongoing, never-ending process, which makes it really exciting, actually. From your own experience, do you have any tips like what really helped you to be better at tasting? Any, I don't know, exercise or rituals or anything that really helped you to improve your whole tasting approach?
I think it's like, the woman who asked the man on the streets of New York, how do I get to Carnegie Hall? And he says, practice, lady, practice. And it's the same with wine tasting. I really, that was absolutely essential for me. I mean, I just had not done enough practice. That's why I failed the first time. And then practicing with friends here in Switzerland on almost a weekly basis, I just got so much better at it. And it's just doing it over and over again. And this is why the people who come from the industry, I think, they're always tasting, and so
Yeah, because they just have the
they're
access.
practicing.
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah. No,
really
absolutely.
think that's what it is. I mean,
Yeah.
some people are born good at it, but most people aren't. And I think that
Oh,
practicing
it's just
and
practicing
thinking
and
about
training.
it's the activity of thinking about everything you're tasting that is crucial.
Mm, mm. Is there, because I don't think that the Divine Academic thesis is available to everybody. I think it's limited to the Divine Academic community only. But is there anywhere like if people want to read and explore maybe your works, where can they kind of follow your publications?
I've got a LinkedIn page and there's a fair amount on there, but also it's pretty easy to run a search for stuff that I've written. But most of what I've written until now has been in areas outside of wine.
Mm,
And anytime I start to publish on wine, I'm going to be putting it on my LinkedIn
okay,
page.
cool. That's easy.
Um,
Yeah.
so I'm going to be putting links into it.
No,
So
because it's definitely a very fascinating topic, and I would love to kind of continue and follow your research and experiments because it's actually helping when you do it in practice, and then you know what's happening in the background from a scientific and logical point of view. I think it can help a lot of people. And knowing you, because you're quite a wine traveler, and always when we are in a WhatsApp group from the Roost Academy, Nick is always like, "Oh, hello from Douro," or like any recommendation for Jerez. So I'm gonna ask you, what was your wine region recommendation, where I or the podcast listeners should go, and why?
well, it depends where they're located, of course, what's easier and what's not. I'm just back from Jura, and that was fascinating. And it's so different from everything else in France,
Oh yeah,
and
absolutely.
it's relatively small, so you can really get around between all the major areas very rapidly. So that is a great place to visit. And in the same way, I found the sherry region fascinating. I really like sherry. And so getting deeply into that in Jerez and also in San Luca for the Manzanillas, that I found that really, really fascinating.
Yeah, I
But
agree with
but
you.
Argentina also, I mean, if you can get to Argentina, and I as I mentioned, I've been all up the Andes towards in the direction of Bolivia, all the way up to Jujuy, but just around Mendoza, there are different vastly different altitudes. The Valle de Uco and Maipú, which is where I was staying, they're very different altitudes. And there's some incredible things going on in the higher altitudes where they can even make good Pinot Noir, for example.
Mm.
I just had a very nice Pinot Noir from Luca, which is a project of Lara Catena, which is
Mhm.
up in Valle de Uco. And yeah, that was very impressive when you think how warm it is down in the valley. Yeah, and the altitude just makes an incredible difference there. So that's a fascinating area to explore, as well as, being very beautiful. And if you like meat, it's a good place to go as well. It's not such a great place for vegetarians.
Oh, nice. Oh, that's so nice. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you overall for the talk. I think it's been really educational. It's super interesting for me, and I would definitely follow your future research. And I hope it brings a lot of value to our podcast listeners as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very
And
much. It's been lovely talking to you.
Well, thank you very much for being with us today and for listening to this episode. I do hope you've learned as much as I did and also found it very interesting and exciting. All of the topics we touched upon it, I'm sure did, especially this little low no alcohol intro that was not meant to be there initially, but I feel like it added value as well. As usually, please like, subscribe, download, rate this episode and podcast. It will help spread the love of wine. And also follow Nicholas on LinkedIn to understand what's happening further with his exciting and intriguing research. I am for sure doing that. And in the future, we'll continue with having 2 episodes per month. There will be no summer break. So I'm gonna see you really soon. Ciao.